all of these objects here are the kind of categories and things we would typically populate our VR applications with. So all of these are VR stuff. So this is some humanoid avatar, like this is you in VR, and you usually have some legs or some other way of locomotion. You have some kind of eyes, you have some kind of thought process, you interact with some kind of object in some kind of way. You see other kind of people or avatars there, and you talk to each other, and there's some room. So let's start with what I would call what I just said kind of the basic assumptions of these things. And I would like us to take the stuff on the left and start to raise doubts. Because remember, the slide that I started every day with was the point of this workshop is to raise doubt. So let's make a list together of what kind of doubts can we raise about these basic assumptions. So if this guy is the humanoid avatar that we're getting bombarded with by everyone these days, sorry, I'm trying to make this a bit smaller. All right, so one of the doubts that I think our conversation so far are raising are things like, does it need to be humanoid? Does it need to have a border? If it does not have a if it does not have a conventional, if it does not have a border, can our brains cope with that? How will we separate each other from other users? Do we need to separate each other from other users? Someone yesterday brought up the question, can two people be in the same avatar? So can one virtual body host two physical people? Then let's see what other things could potentially come up from our discussions that start to question this standard humanoid avatar. I guess another one thing that we should put in, does it, or I guess it's a bit related to the other question, but is there a one-on-one correspondence to a physical human? Because we are starting to see a lot of like hybrid stuff. There was an article that I think was published in Nature yesterday or 2 days ago. I will see if I have time to bring it up tomorrow, about virtual avatars controlling robotic hands. So hybrids within the same body, or that control the same body, control the same avatars. And here we have physical humans. We have some kind of other intelligent agents. I guess we could also have like non-intelligent agents, like robots that react to, I run into terminology rut. So I guess by intelligent agents, I really mean like more like neural network kind of driven stuff, but then there are also robots, and these robots, they, you know, the kind of stuff that they put on rovers and they go to the moon and then they react to things, and then you go into an avatar and then you have certain kind of correspondences with the limbs of the robots. I'm gonna call them non-intelligent, although that's probably not the right terminology.
Do we want to talk?
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about how the avatar can communicate? Does it expand? Does it get taller than you do, intimidate you? Does it change color to express emotion? How does the avatar communicate? Is it purely?
Yes. So communication, I think, is a huge deal. Yeah, I guess it goes a bit into the discussion from yesterday with how humans communicate by using energy to change something mechanical, right? Like that's how we communicate. We mechanically move our mouth, that then moves air particles into waves, or we mechanically take a pen and write something on a piece of paper. So there's a mechanical substrate to that. And in the virtual space, a lot of that is or should be out the window, and it should be replaced by different kind of communication protocols, I guess. So
Andrea, another question.
Yeah.
I'll wait until you hear that.
Is not mechanically produced. Oh God, this is not the right word, but let's just go for it. Yes.
And that alternative communication protocols, what you also mentioned before. I was wondering if we collectively control an abstract body that doesn't have clear borders, then at which point does this body become an environment?
Yeah, that's a great one.
One point to add to this too is something I haven't really heard spoken about too much here is the idea of the sensorium of the avatar. And we talk a lot about the visual appearance of the avatar, but in our everyday experience, I guess we're not really looking at ourselves so much, but we're experiencing things in a more through other senses. And we have a sensory motor proprioceptive experience of the world. A lot of my research is in haptics and somatics in VR. And I think that might be important to think about in how the sensory motor body of the avatar maps to their world and how that maps onto our senses. Because and back to the idea of the one-to-one correspondence, it really doesn't have to be one-to-one at all and can be quite bizarre. And I think also thinking about the blurring of the body, the boundaries, the environment, we have different senses that give us more proximal or distal information about our environment, things that feel more allocentric, for example, or we have things that feel more localized to what's happening on our body. So I think we could have some sort of blurring, but we also have a sort of blurring that happens through different sensory channels, I think, already. And so thinking about what that would be for an avatar versus us.
Yeah, for sure. And I think here now maybe it might be good to also add this guy. So when I first started working in VR, I was one of the things that I found most fascinating was the fact that your eyes in VR are just cameras, and it's just a stupid setting that makes you think that you see in VR the way you see in physical reality, right? But you can just touch a slider and oops, you're just gonna see in a different kind of way. So I find this something that it's really taken for granted. And again, the question is like, well, why would you see it differently, or why would you like change that? But for me, that's not the point. For me, the point is that we just have to acknowledge that the fundamental nature of your vision in VR is completely artificial, and is just is because of a very careful manipulation that it's mimicking somewhat your actual vision, but the space of possibility of those cameras is actually very, very different than the space of possibility of your actual eyes. They overlap. They can overlap, but it's a fundamentally different thing. So I would like us to question the body overall as in embodiment and body schema and proprioception. But I think there's interesting direction to also question the individual senses, and the relationship between the senses of our physical body that we still need to rely on to get the information in from the physical world, right? But it's almost like it's a two-gate thing. So there's the gate of the senses of the physical body, and then there is this doubling that we're not acknowledging. There's the other gate, which is the fake senses on top of our physical senses that are in the game engine.
I wanted to add something to what you were just saying, Andrea, if I may.
Yeah.
So I was just working on a paper on virtual production in cinema. I come from a cinema background, but I think it's still interesting for what we're saying right now. And there was this author in like 2007 who wrote a paper on like virtual cameras, and like eventually we'll go and create an aesthetic that is wholly unique to virtual cameras and will outpace what cinema has done. This is not the case. Like with The Lion King, Mandalorian, all this virtual production, we're still like drawn to how films have been made historically and the look of what a lens, a 35 millimeter, 50, and so on. And I feel it speaks to what we can do with VR. Like a virtual camera has no lens, it has no focal distance, no field of view, not mechanically imparted. It has to be chosen and selected. So it's interesting that like trying to reproduce the way we see the world with like the kind of field of view and interpupillary distance that is that of humans is like only one way to do things. And I can understand why it's like the dominant way of reproducing, like allowing us to see the world in VR in a way that is similar to how we see the world in real life. But it's only one of innumerable ways of doing things. So yeah, it's interesting that like this has been discussed in the field of like cinema and animation, like computer graphics. Oh, we can do anything we want, but we just keep repeating the way things have been done in the past, just finding new ways of doing the same old things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the purpose of this list that we're doing now is not to answer the question, what for? Because we haven't even gotten there. And I think the reason why sometimes we're stuck with what for or what we're doing or with repeating previous stuff is because we do not fundamentally understand these things. So it's more like let's list and let's try to have a deeper understanding of what is vision in VR. And it seems such a basic stuff, and yet I really think we are making assumptions that is not what the reality is. So I'm trying now to have us together develop a more realistic base, believable understanding of this basic stuff and progressively eliminate assumptions, because I feel like we're really swimming in assumptions when it comes to these virtual places. It's like we're all so eager to buy into the illusion that you put a headset on and oh, you see something that looks kind of 3D. We're too eager to buy into that illusion. So I think to make the next step, we need to take a step back. So in a sense, the stuff that is here on the left, I meant these to help us a little bit as aids, to give us ideas on how to question perhaps some of the assumptions we might be doing. There was back here with communication. So I think there was a comment that I did not fully capture in here. If you feel like that's the case, could you maybe say it again? There was a further point about communication and communication protocols.
I brought up the communication and it just been randomly thinking about things like using an avatar in multiple ways beyond speech, color, size, just other ways in which one can take an avatar and express themselves, either dominance or submission or love or sadness. There are a million ways we can do it with an avatar other than speech or gestures. There are other ways we can communicate things.
Yep. Yeah, and what I was trying to write above, I think avatars can also allow us to receive maybe forms of information perhaps and input that our senses in the physical body perhaps cannot. But I think we're still to find some concrete examples of that. And I think also the thing that's really on my mind sometimes is really this doubling, right? There's because we can't get rid of the, oh, where did that go? We cannot get rid of the doubling. Sorry, I'm trying to make this guy like another color and then they disappear. So there's always the physical you behind the virtual you. So we always need to consider things on these parallel levels, and the parallel levels cannot be forgotten, but they're also not the same thing. And I guess many assumptions right now in VR is that they're the same thing. They're not acknowledging the doubling. They're not acknowledging the gaps between the doubling. They're not acknowledging all these ways in which the virtual double can start to do different things in different ways, and even start to, technically send information and feedback to the physical, let's call it the first double and the second double, to the first double, that perhaps can go beyond a mimicking of sound and vision and so on.
Do we want to talk about the fact that it can add and reduce bias?
What do you mean by that?
It has, an avatar has the possibility to remove race, gender, inherent biases in terms of communication, and that you can be a tree, which then removes questions of gender and race and culture, and you're now just talking to a tree.
As a sociologist, I would push back on that, say there's very, very much all this stuff gets dragged into VR. And there's no escaping it.
So I was specifically referring to the avatar itself.
Maybe we can rephrase this as break like body-based categories.
Right.
Because I think it's a discussion of categories, like everything you mentioned is not really it's not a category of nature, right? Although, well, that's a bigger discussion we should not get into, but like small person, big person, woman, person of color, and so on, these are categories that we use in our social reality. It's debatable in each instance to what extent they may or may not be categories used in nature, and if nature even uses categories. So it can break some of that, and I think the consequence is, since these categories are mostly used in the social reality, since categories are used to build the social reality, once these categories or some of them are broken down in VR, then that should perhaps in certain cases open up the way for a different, not a completely different social reality, but for some manipulation or for some more freedom, although I don't like the word freedom either. So since categories used to build a social reality, can eliminating or obfuscating some of them in VR open up things ... I do think we are seeing some of this in some social VR worlds for sure. We are seeing avatars that show like fluidity of gender. We're seeing some interesting dynamics happening. We're seeing people that use sign language in physical reality develop further notations that they do with the hands and feet of their avatars to extend sign language. So we are seeing certain reorganizations that have to do with social aspects of what's happening there. So if we, let's go to objects. So this one, I always feel like it's kind of low hanging fruit, but also hard to like wrap your my head around sometimes. So virtual objects, what in the world are virtual objects? And what, I mean, what makes them virtual objects, right? It's like, man, I really struggle with this, although it seems so simple. So I put a shader on them. So they're these things that are made with like vertices, and I create these vertices, and then I put a shader on them that connects these vertices and then makes them look like they have a skin on them. But in essence, they're just kind of, they're like cloud points, and I can write shaders to manipulate their appearance. But they have some kind of cloud point structure, and they have some metadata, but that's basically what they are. And in some cases, they can also be animated and transformed, or they can be streamed, their data can be altered. So it's not that easy actually to put your finger on what virtual objects are. I think the fact that we're carrying the word object to describe them is also harming us, because again, it's giving us the wrong idea of what these entities are. So we know they're not agents, or well, they could be. Let's say we know they're not human. But they definitely do not have the same kind of objecthood that a physical cup or a physical glass has. Their potentiality is actually completely different. Their affordances, because of this nature of being a structure of points whose appearance can be easily altered, this gives them potentialities that physical objects do not have. But because we do not truly acknowledge this or know what to do with it, we keep going pretending they are kind of like physical objects, but in VR, so our hand can go through them, which is just dumb because that's really not what they are. So that's my thought on virtual objects, and I'm really like irked by them. So I was wondering, I was wondering if anyone else has issues with virtual objects, and like what's your reaction to them?
Oh, hang on. I was literally about to post this in the chat. One second.
Yeah.
So I think there's, just at a cursory glance, there's like two sort of accepted definitions for object. And I think there's the one that people use colloquially and most frequently, which is described as a material that can be seen and touched. And for the most part, that carries over for virtual objects if you're talking about collision detection and your shaders. But I think you're specifically hinting at the second definition that they provide, which is a person or thing to which a specified action or feeling is directed.
Let's write that down. Say that again. A person or thing to which a specific
action or feeling is directed.
Who said this?
This is just the second definition for object off of Google.
A person or thing to which a specific action or feeling is directed. That's fascinating. So how does the nature of this statement change whether when like how, so if we take this statement and we apply it to like a physical cup, and then we take this statement and we apply it to a virtual cup, does anything change, or does the statement just stay the same? Does it start to wobble anywhere? Well, the first thing is like someone needs to do the directing, right? So it's assuming a subject that is that the feeling and the directed part is assuming a subject that's doing the feeling and doing the direct, maybe not the direction, but that's experiencing the feeling.
The second phrase does the thing that you have been referring to from the start. It says, okay, both things exist because they're perceived, but in the second case, you take out the mechanical, physical reality. And once you accept that this needs to go out, then you can start to fool around with the potential of what the object can be.
Mm. Yeah, so the parts of this statement that for me are kind of ripe for being question and attack are action and feeling. So there has to be a subject involved in this action and feeling. But yeah, I think I'll need a bit more time to wrap my head around it. Otherwise, we're going to slide into too much abstraction and abstract thought.
So what about objects that exist on their own without being observed or without having a feeling directed towards it, where it is an environment that you can leave, everyone can leave and on their own can deteriorate? Let's say it's an environment. It can literally, the trees can get older, they can rot. And when you come back, these objects are now different. They're not, and they have not been affected by anyone directing anything towards them. They have their own life, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I guess that goes to whether or not you're mandating that the action or feeling or things that affect those objects and environments are necessarily human agent based, rather than, I mean, a software algorithm that applies degradation over time could still be maybe not morally, but definitely objectively qualified as an agent. It performs actions, it does things, it has a given input and output. I think if you can make the leap to not needing an observer or not needing a human agent, but I think that lends you in the territory of if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, sure, it makes a sound, but does the sound actually matter? Do we need to capture it? Do we need to record it? Do we need to make a note of it? If it doesn't affect any actual agents, does it matter?
Yeah, the point I was making is that where it would matter is if a tree falls in the forest, when you first go in the environment, the tree is upright. When you come back 6 weeks later, it's fallen. It has now changed your interaction with that world because the object is now different. That's what I was implying there, is that the objects could do things.
The
without.
objects could change. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe there's what's a question mark is our assumption that these virtual objects have to stay the same, and they're always rendered in the same kind of way, like they don't acquire patina for whatever reason they would acquire patina. So are there any processes that might make virtual objects change? I mean, yeah, oh God, this also sounds silly. Of course, there are many processes that why these would change. I just basically my thinking beyond trying to make this kind of list, and you can see it's a bit of a torturous process where on one hand it sounds intuitive, on the other hand it's like, oh yay, and then you write it down and it sounds stupid. Is because I think most of the time we're not interrogating their nature enough. We always assume they're kind of this dumb thing, and we're not taking full advantage of their virtual nature.
Andrea, can I offer a perspective and a thought if I can?
Yes.
So I think we might be looking at this in the wrong direction, because an object, either physical or virtual, if you look at it by itself, it's just an object with no meaning. I think meaning starts to emerge when you actually associate it with a person. So going back to your methodology, if we are looking at this from a phenomenological approach, so describing the world through a human understanding, I would say that, first of all, two things. A virtual object and a physical object, to me, could be the same thing if you take into consideration that if I live in the physical world, then I have affordances with physical objects. If I live in a virtual world, I have alternative affordances with virtual objects. So that's one thought. The second thing that comes into me from the human perspective is I'm thinking, okay, so what creates value to an object for me? So I do have a watch, for example, that was passed down from my grandfather. That is an object that has value to me. And it's something that the virtual object, probably in the short span of virtual objects, does not allow me to make that connection with it. On the other hand, if I'm playing a video game, I'm playing, I don't know, World of Warcraft, and I do have a specific weapon, which is my favorite, and I use it to go on raids or whatever, if one day that weapon disappears from my inventory, I will get upset. So there is a connection with that virtual object because of the meaning that it has with me. So yeah, maybe that's another way of thinking things.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is so valuable. So meaning and context. Meaning and context is something that we need to wrap our heads around, and it should be on this list. The only thing from what you said that I would maybe question a little bit is the human-centric perspective of the way you phrase things. There is, for example, this very strong school in design called human-centered design, right? So that's kind of what's still being taught everywhere. Make sure that the software that you make works with a person and you understand the affordances and all of that. So I think that absolutely makes sense, but we're dealing increasingly with the context and with types of objects that are not necessarily so close to the human world and to the human understanding in many ways. There are things going on in back end of servers, there are things going on with AIs. There are these things called hyperobjects that are human-made concepts and objects and realities, sometimes with physical size to them, that we cannot even wrap our heads around, that go back to what Bob Horn calls knotty problems. So I think there's an increasing domain of processes and things and objects and value creation and meaning that is going further and further away from what we call human understanding and human meaning. And as we are increasing the complexity of the kind of systems that we produce, specifically in IT, we are opening up these kind of gates. So we're running out of time now, but I can go a little bit further into hyperobjects and Timothy Morton next time, because he's part of a school of thought in philosophy that I somewhat subscribe to, that is starting to describe, is starting to point out these things in the human reality, how sometimes we still function under the wrong assumption that everything is human-centric, whereas humans have started to produce things that in reality are less and less human-centric. And in some cases, we are aware of them and we manipulate them to our use. In some cases, they're getting out of hand. And we struggle to wrap our heads around it. Now, how does that have to do with like a virtual teacup? I think it does not directly. It just feels like it's something that should be on the table and it should be addressed, because it feels like we cannot discuss meaning and context anymore without acknowledging these perspectives, whether you agree with them or not. These perspectives that we're starting to have meaning and context, which is important, which is not human-centric. And you can argue that perhaps was not the case a few hundred years ago, that back then everything was clearly human-centric.
If I may add something to this discussion of Timothy Morton, and like it's something I mentioned the other day, I believe, Ian Bogust's alien phenomenology, or what it's like to be a thing. And I think,
I said that I wanted to start this discussion again from Doris's comment on human meaning and the importance of that in trying to figure out what virtual objects are. And I said that yesterday I failed to get us any clarity on this, and I found that despite being a failure on my part, I found that very intriguing, and it made me think of how we should discuss the importance of, like, where again, this is super philosophical. When something is unclear, why is it unclear, and where do you go to get answers? And when do you, for me personally, this is where you start to perhaps pull in resources from other fields, and you try to experiment with that. I think we mentioned last time OOO, object-oriented ontology. So for me personally, that's where I would go in this particular case, to try to neatly, or not neatly, to try to find some sense of direction. But it's important for each of us to have our own methodology to get ourselves out of it, and to put a finger on how to, sorry, I'm kind of babbling, I'm repeating myself, on how to get out of this, and how to find, because the point is to find a definition or an understanding that can be tentative and not great, but it should feel satisfying, right? It should feel like something you want to wake up the next day and you're excited to try to validate it the next day in the morning, or you're excited to build a project on top of it, right? Which means you're making these assumptions, you're making these connections, you have some understanding of the relationship between virtual objects and human meaning, and perhaps you dedicate a little study to it or a project, and that could be the next 3-4 months out of your life. So it's important before you start to have something that's somewhat solid and you feel somewhat excited about, and not something that's vague and poorly defined. And so some of you might disagree with me, and if you do, rightly so. My particular way of doing that, again, is to build on literature, but not necessarily to literally bring in concepts and put them in, but to use the intellectual structure that they provide me. And then I keep adding on that intellectual structure, or that structure of ideas. I keep adding ideas that are specific to VR. So that's kind of my way of doing things. But I'm sure people might have other strategies, and I'd also be interested in hearing about that. In academia, from what I know from my friends in academia, what happens a lot of the time is you are within, like when you are a student or a postdoc, you work within a lab, or within you get your training within a certain framework that usually comes from the principal investigator or from whatever the orientation of your department is. So you're already working within an intellectual context that provides you that kind of direction, that's not just specific to the discipline, but specific to that principal investigator and to that department, and perhaps to a certain like more senior professor there. And then you kind of decide when you are more senior in your career what you do. But I find myself with VR and with the kind of work that we're trying to do, really not having that, or finding that one intellectual tradition really falls short of giving me satisfying directions. And that's basically where this need is coming up for me personally, and that I'm just trying to kind of introduce you to, of pulling together sources and concepts and basically intellectual scaffolding from these various areas. So that was kind of the comment I had here, and I wrote here in caps, towards action and feeling. So many times you will run into words that feel central to what you're going after, specifically in the context of VR, but damn it, you just can't put your finger on what the heck that means. And again, every book you open will have a different assumption or a different definition for that. So again, here in my case, I find the need to just try to define that in my own way, and again try to define that in the context of VR. So what is feeling in VR? What is action in VR? And the examples that Doros gave, for example, for generating both feeling and strategies to get users towards action, were very beautiful and very VR specific. So just briefly, I wanted to kind of show you what else we have here. So we said that these little icons represent things that people don't question enough, in my opinion, when they talk about VR. So we had people, and then we talked about how there's this doubling. There's the physical body and the virtual body, and we don't question enough the virtual body. We don't question enough the relationship between the virtual body and the physical body. And of course, like all these theories here on the left are showing, we don't even fully understand or necessarily act on accurate assumptions about how the physical body functions. And then the same kind of doubling happens with vision, and the same kind of line of questioning applies. We do not fully acknowledge that vision in VR is a very fake kind of vision. And our assumptions about how actual vision works are also quite many times quite skewed and led by simplistic ideas that are being given to us in a cultural context. Then virtual objects, I think, are insufficiently defined. And then up here, what we have is, well, grabbing this issue of interaction. Basically, this is what this is supposed to represent. I think there are many lists like this that we could start to write, and perhaps we should, where we're rethinking what does interaction mean. So maybe we do start a little one. I'm going to duplicate this one. So interaction in a the way we're thinking about it now mostly grabbing something with some kind of fake hand, right? So grabbing a virtual object that usually is represented the way a physical object would be, so that looks kind of solid-ish most of the time. And then we're grabbing it with some kind of appendage. So we're grabbing it with a controller or some kind of fake hand. We also grab it with some kind of laser. So that's an extension. And back in the day of Oculus Go and Daydream, where we did not have 6 degrees of freedom. We only had 3 degrees of freedom in the controller. We were also moving and grabbing stuff with the gaze. So gaze, we were tracking where you were looking for a certain amount of time, and then that would trigger some kind of action. But I'm wondering if there are any kind of things that come to mind right now in the context of all these wild discussions that would imply a different kind of grabbing, a different kind of interaction.
Muhammad.
Oh, all right. I think someone is not muted, so I'll continue. I think someone is not muted, and we can hear perhaps your family or some background voices. So maybe you could mute your mic, unless you're trying to add to the discussion, in which case, please do that. All right. So when we're thinking of, yeah.
I have a quick question, Andrea.
Yeah.
So in terms of defining this as interactivity in VR, does this mean we're treating interactivity in terms of things like communication, interacting with other people, interacting with objects, echolocation? Are we speaking specifically here about moving objects, or what do we mean by interactivity in VR? How are we defining that?
So here, what I had in mind was actually displacing things, but I think you're right.
Okay.
So, but I actually think you're right. So I think before we get into any kind of specifics, we need to clarify what kind of interactions can we think of actually, and then of course the other difficulties, like what are the parties interacting? Because we've just spent yesterday completely deconstructing or attempting to deconstruct the avatars and the embodiment, and discussing avatars with maybe unclear boundaries. And then we try to take virtual objects towards a definition that's a bit more true to, I call them like what they really are, which is this cloud of points. So it even what's the nature of the parties interacting is kind of unclear. But I think that's where the potential starts to come up. So my overarching intention is to start to show you guys how when you are starting to push the boundary of the definition and the conceptualization of objects and avatars, then that opens up a new kind of potential thinking about interactions. But you're right, we should clarify what kind of interaction. So I said displacement, displacement, oh shoot, I can't tab here. So displacement of, I don't know, stuff. I don't want to call them object, stuff, displacement of stuff. But there are other kind of interactions, right? So it's, I guess, man, there's the maybe also the issue of communication. So what do we communicate? We communicate. Let's leave text aside because that's a complicated one. So text, so there's, I guess there's text, there's audio, there's ways to communicate emotion, and we might communicate other kind of feedback.
I have a thought here that might be helpful. In like physical computing, there's a distinction between sensing, processing, and or action. And there are many ways that we can act. And so we're always mapping, if we're working in a virtual environment, to our physical body in this real actual world in some way. However, it's instantiated in an avatar. And I think thinking about the ways that we can measure the ways that we interact in the world, there's many different ways it could interact. And then there's many ways we could think of an embodiment and an action, a way to interact with an object in another environment. And so there's, it can be data, it can be biometric information, it could be like our heart rate, or even like galvanic skin response, which is now electrodermal activity. And I think so there's this notion of like an end effector, like a hand or something, or there's grasping or something. But I mean, there could be an osmosis of things. I've done virtual environments where people affect a virtual environment through electrodermal activity collectively, like a bunch of people, like depending on how stressed out or calm a group of people are, will affect an object in a virtual environment, or how their interactions, if they're interacting in a cooperative manner, that affects the behavior and movement of objects in an environment. So is that a limb? Is that grasping? I think it kind of starts to melt that notion in a way. And I think we can kind of think of these in a different light, or think of what it means to create action, what we're measuring for. Because in the examples I gave, some of it's actions that are emergent between people, things that we don't really think about as a limb per se in this environment. So
yeah, that's definitely useful. And it made me think that I think perhaps the categories that I'm seeing while you are talking are more like, or how I would go next. So I started writing this list here, including like electrodermal activity that you mentioned. And then I thought, okay, perhaps the two categories are actions human agents can perform, and then actions that are performed on human agents. And of course, all of this is like tech mediated. And I actually think here there are two subcategories. And so what is the, I guess I'm going to call it the impulse or action in the physical body, because something the initial action has to be initiated in the physical body somehow, even in whatever sense, and then somehow there's a translation that happens into that impulse and action initiated in the physical body, somehow gets tech mediated into whatever virtual presence or form of embodiment we're dealing with. And I think here, see, we have some arrows. So this is tech mediated. And because it's tech mediated, this relationship is quite interesting and quite flexible, right? So this is kind of where the fun of this technology begins, that there is no one-to-one. Like in physical reality, we have the impulse and the action, and it's quite direct what we see the physical body perform, right? Even if it's talking. So we're pushing air out of our mouth from our lungs, and that creates the sound waves. But in the case of VR, we have this tech mediation happening. So what the body does can have many, many forms in which it can become a form of communication in the virtual space. And I think here we can start to brainstorm quite a lot of things. So it's about, and we would need to brainstorm in these three areas, right? So we would need to brainstorm, let's see, we would need to brainstorm here what is the initial impulse, like what do you do with your physical body as the impulse. Then we would need to brainstorm, I guess we would go here then, what do we, or I don't know, maybe we go here next, I don't know what 2 is. How do we mediate that, like what's the tech part of that, and then what does that look like, how is that being translated and expressed in the virtual form. And then this column is also potentially very interesting, right? Because in the physical world, we're pretty in control of what is being done to our physical body, right? Like the people, we have legislation that makes sure that people cannot just randomly come and touch us and push us and do things to us. So we can control who touches our physical body. We cannot control that much, or depends on the circumstance, what we hear, although of course we most of the time have the freedom to just leave and go into a space where we can't hear things. We don't have that much control over things like, is it hot? Well, somewhat, but things are being performed on us in the physical reality. I think there's a fascinating list of potential things that are performed on us as human agents in the virtual space. And I think in this case, perhaps we start with this one. So what can be performed on us depends on, or how we perceive that depends on the particular type of embodiment or presence that we have that day or in that situation. And then the arrow, I feel like almost goes the other way, where there's some kind of tech impulse. I know this is completely unclear, but I can't think of anything better now, so I'll just call it tech impulse. There's some kind of reason why something is being pushed onto us in this particular presence that we might have, and I think this is another thing that would be fascinating to brainstorm as to, like, who and why. Is this something automatic? For example, we're working in this virtual architectural design environment that we've been working on for about almost 3 years now, actually. We're very interested in bringing in climate data. So we're looking at creating ways to get live, like a stream of live climate data coming in from weather stations from the vicinity of your construction site, and taking that into a set of animations that actually affect the space around your virtual presence. So you can start to have a little bit of a phenomenal understanding of whether it is cold, is it windy, is it rainy in that particular location. So that would be, I guess, perhaps a little like a simple example of what there would be some kind of automated tech impulse. Again, dumb name, but let's stick with it for now. Tech impulse that would be pushed automatically on your virtual presence with a certain kind of goal. But I think this can be taken much, much, much further. And
Andrea?
Yeah.
Can I throw a couple of examples in here that may help clarify some of this? This is
Please do. Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, the reason I was asking about interactivity is I used to work on simulations, political simulations, football simulations, and the like, where in just the act of a presence, someone coming into an environment shifts how the rest of the environment and characters behave. They don't have to do anything. The very act of them entering the world, they begin interaction just by their presence. And very similar to, you have a placid field of sheep and a wolf shows up. The wolf doesn't have to do anything, but the environment is now completely different by the mere presence interacting with a wolf in a bunch of sheep. So that's the kind of interactivity I'm curious about in terms of, does your avatar do that? Is it the specs of past behavior? Is it your, any number of things that would affect your environment in terms of being interactive, and you don't have to do a thing. You just have to be there. Your presence is interactive in and of itself.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's something that happens in the physical reality as well, but we do not have that much conscious awareness of. It's something that is often actually talked about in the books that I've been referencing, where everything another human being around you does, everything they say, everything they talk has a very deep impact on you, even if you think it might not. And of course, that has so many layers and so much to look into, but it's in popular culture, it just translates in these like silly pictures that say, okay, you are what you listen to, or you are what you're looking at. So at a superficial level, that's true. But yeah, I think what you said is kind of that in physical reality, but what you're describing is or what you're asking is, what would that be in the virtual space, where your simple presence there starts to affect the environment and affect the other agents, right?
Right. And another example is in Pandora X, the VR program, Pandora X. They had a character where the crowd would meet this character, and this character grew as a god, a Greek god, grew in size many times more than the other characters in the play. And that literal act of changing that avatar affected the entire environment and how all the characters interacted. And all this character did was had their avatar become larger. So that's the kind of interactivity, besides just moving objects, that I'm curious, how do we define that, since VR has so many possibilities for that in terms of how you control yourself, size, sound, look, feel.
Sorry,
so that's what I'm curious about. Yeah.
I think there's still something. So there's something here that is not I think this is hard to wrap our heads around, because there's still a piece that's not defined. So again, I'm kind of harking back to the like trying to form intellectual structures and logical structures to get us further. So for me, in what you described, or what's different in virtual space as opposed to physical space is this change of the avatar, right? So it's not simply that you put on the headset and you just appear there or are present there. Is what's the form of that presence, and who are you there, and what are the, like, what are your powers in that world? So that's something that's completely up in the air, or to be defined, or to be written by the rules of that world and the programmers, right? And that's completely not that's not how we talk about physical reality. It's not that or we do talk about that, but in a very different sense. You know, I can't just walk into a room and expect people to react very, very differently, or to have like completely different powers in this room as opposed to the other room. But so there's a piece that has to do with your role and your agency, and the connection between your particular role or form of embodiment and the rest of the environment that still has to be defined, which is fixed in physical reality, but not in these virtual worlds. Does that make sense, Charlie?
Yeah, I would say that, and I don't want to derail the subject at all. The other example I would use, when we did John Madden football, each character was embodied with real life attributes of a real human being in the real world, a real football player that existed in real life. And who was on the field at the time altered how the entire environment played. So if you removed one person and put those real attributes of another real person in there, everything would behave differently, just by the act of who they were in real life, and what they achieved and what they were capable of doing. So that's the kind of presence I'm talking about.
Yes. Okay. So yeah. So there's a connection between your presence and the world, but the logic of that connection is something to be defined per world.
Right.
I guess that's what I'm getting at. So I'm trying to put my finger on what's the structure of this relationship between your presence and the world that's perhaps different than in physical reality. And for me, it might be that, right? That the logic of that coupling between your presence and the world, and how your presence changes the world, that logic and that coupling is up for grabs in a way, right? At the programming level, or at the mastermind level.
Right.
So
it could be as simple as predator, non-predator. Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that's one example, but it could be many types of relationships. So the prey and predator, with the wolf just dropping in all of a sudden, it's one very clear example. But if we were to brainstorm the list of other potential relationships, I bet we come up with some pretty fascinating things on that list.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah. Carl, there you are. There you are. Yes.
Oh, hey, sorry. My quality may be terrible. I'm in the car right now. I just wanted to comment on this before I forget. So you brought up the wolf and the sheep example, or the football example for players. I think ultimately what you're trying to get at is that the introduction of a new presence changes the environment. But that change, I believe, would be correlated, if not causatively linked, to recognition and association. So in the case of the sheep see the wolf and they recognize it as a threat, as a predator, and they associate it with danger. So they respond differently. In the case of the football, they recognize a different player and they associate different skills or different strengths and weaknesses with that new player. So if you translate that into VR, and we go along with Andrea's line of thinking where we're trying to abstract or be in the thought space of what different forms would look like. So if you're just in a space as a human, a user agent in VR, and there's just an amorphous mass, a blob over in the corner, you'll respond differently if that mass is sitting still, if it has an animated texture on it, or if it's moving, particularly towards or away from you. And that association, that recognition. If you don't immediately recognize what the object is and you have nothing to associate it with, you're going to drop back into the sort of unknown space, and that tends to evoke either fear, curiosity, or both. And so I think you'll have to be. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out, but I think the recognition and association that goes along with certain forms or certain objects is what elicits that change in environment just by the introduction or presence of that thing. Over.
I would like to build on that. If I look at the schedule here, you have actions that human agents can perform and actions that are performed on human agents. So in between those two, I would suggest there's something that has to do with feedback or response. So if I'm grabbing something, then I get haptic feedback. Or if I move through a space, I can feel the wind of movement on my skin, or I can feel the warmth or coldness of something. So there's somewhere in the middle, something about response and feeling of that response. And the other dimension I would like to add, you have now actions human agents can perform. I would be interested to see actions that non-human agents can perform or that are performed on non-human agents. Like, for example, ants, animals, or plants, or other things. And what sort of behavioral skills or what sort of new senses or new insights can I get if I have the same insights as the ants or the plants? So it's like there's a great recent book by James Bridle called New Ways of Being. Long story short, starts with artificial intelligence trying to mimic human intelligence, but maybe that's not the right benchmark. So what are other non-human intelligences? And in this case, what are non-human ways of seeing and sensing the world that we can learn something from? And
so I think that will, that sort of phenomenon is studied a lot in sort of in the UX space for game design. Is you sit the user down, you hand them a piece of software, whether it's a game or an office application, doesn't really matter. And you tell them, okay, use the application, here are your tasks, here are your goals. And then you monitor them as they try to perform those tasks. And the main thing that you're looking for as a UX researcher is what their expectations are when they push a button or when they open a menu or when they go to look for something. So the user has expectations and they're normally not explicitly defined, or they can't tell you what they are. But that sort of can be organically discovered as you see them bumble or work their way through the software. And that being translated onto, it comes up a lot in VR because you see people who expect to be able to interact with certain objects or pick up certain things or touch certain things. And they're always either surprised or disappointed when they can't, because the object hasn't been programmed to be pick upable, if you will, or things along that line. So the sort of expectation of what should happen when you perform an action and the actual outcome, if there's affordances that can help you communicate to the user what they should expect so that they're not surprised, confused, or disappointed as often. But that may be the area you want to play with if you're working with non-standard type of stuff. Over.
Yeah, I want to add a thought on that. So as I was hinting a little bit at the difficulty of developing UX for things that do not have a clear analogy in physical reality. I love to, let me put it differently. The kind of stuff that I'm most interested in are not the things that are good UX practices, right? To put it bluntly, where I believe that in order to gain new affordances, so in order to even attempt this kind of stuff that I think Petervan was hinting at, so a change in perspective that is tech mediated. So an opening up of either the perceptual field of possibility or the cognitive field of possibility to tech mediation. I want to propose that perhaps in order to make that possible, you need to break to those expectations to gain these new affordances. So because I think what you described is like people going in and expecting going in with assumptions, right? About, okay, if I click this, maybe this will happen, or this looks like if I do this to it, this thing will happen. And traditional good UI practices, or even current or good UI practices in general, tell you you should try to meet those expectations. Otherwise, you're just gonna confuse people and produce a shit product. In the context of this conversation, I think if you just stick to what people assume intuitively from physical reality, you can't get that far. You might fail at this tech mediated shift in perspective. So you have to do some damage first and break a few things, and that assumes dealing with certain kind of people that can suffer through that. It's, for me, the analogy is very similar to learning new foreign languages. I mean, learning a new foreign language is one of the most frustrating things you'll ever do. And yet that's just what you have to do to get that shift in perspective. And there's no shortcut. But Carl, I wonder, like, does this resonate with you, or do you have a totally different take on it?
No. You're 100% right in that if you're trying to get into a new space, if you're trying to make a new language, if you want to put it that way, or make a new set of expectations, a new unwritten language of affordances or typical interaction-based practices in VR, then you're going to have to break the norms. You're going to have to deviate from those established, if you want this outcome, do that. But what I was meaning is that if you're looking to build a new UX or a new type of language, even if it doesn't fit with the established norms, you can look to the formalized UX discipline for how they got from where they started to where they are now and see, okay, well, they wanted users to do this, or the users expected to do that. And over the course of these changes in interaction or hardware or widgets or whatever it was, that eventually led the users to change their expectations or to lump it when they didn't, when something happened that they weren't expecting to happen. Yeah. So you can look to that sort of structure to help you build your new language, your new affordances, your new et cetera. But certainly don't just copy and paste the rules for an expected outcome if you're trying to change the outcome. Over.
Yeah. So there has to be, in whatever you're doing, there has to be like this kind of thing where you have to, you start with some user expectations, then there's an arrow that's your strategy to get to change their expectations, and then if you're lucky, you get to like new user behavior or new user behavior assumptions. But I think what you're saying is that you just need a plan for that. You can't just drop them in there. Like you need to hold their hand and walk them along that path to get them here. You're not just going to have them there from the beginning.
If I could add a little bit to this, Andrea, as well. I think we might fall in a bit of a trap in some respect with that, because we already have a discipline that already attempted doing this, which is the game industry, in my opinion. So you do have reality, and you do have the game industry that kind of went in with exactly the same strategy that you're describing right now. And they already broke certain expectations and created the surprise in certain areas. I'll give you some examples so I can be more clear on what I mean. Okay, so for example, we see a dark tunnel. We know that if you walk down in real life, down a dark tunnel, that could signify danger. So the game industry has taken that, and they already use that analogy in a game that says, okay, there's a dark tunnel, there's no light, maybe some blood at the entrance. You know what's going to happen if you go down that dark tunnel. Now, if we do come in here and we kind of break that expectation, I don't know, you walk down the tunnel and you find lights and bright stuff at the other side, the users might get confused instead of pleasantly surprised and look at this in a different way. So essentially, when we are trying to retrain something which is already a preconception. So I think we need to treat this very carefully. The other thing that I wanted to say about space in general, I think we can learn a lot about architecture. Probably most of you guys know much more than me on how to design spaces in order to guide people into certain areas. So for example, you want to kind of signify to people, this is the correct route. You would have certain mechanisms while designing a space that shows this is where you should go. And maybe have, I don't know, arrows or shapes which converge towards that direction, or more lights or whatever. So I guess designing space is what I'm getting at, a very important way to kind of show people how to move around the space that we want to build. So maybe we can play around with that. And environmental storytelling, again, coming from games, is another way to kind of point to certain directions. So famous examples from games, you are trying to open a door, you don't know how to do it, there is a big poster on the wall that kind of tells you the way to do it. So you need to be observant, you need to go and look at that, and that's going to take you through the process of actually doing that. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting approach, but I think it's also something that people have tried before. So we are essentially retrying something which have been thought before through the game industry.
So I'll comment on that and say that if there's a known objective, especially a common objective that already has like a pre-established language for what you're supposed to do or how you communicate that to your user. If there's already a sort of well-known or well-documented task that is easily transferable to the human space or the gaming space, then certainly you're right. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of Andrea's work and what she's trying to move towards is not reinventing the wheel for current context or current problems or current tasks that you want the user to do. She's trying to leverage VR as a means of abstraction and to pull away from the sort of established forms and languages that we already have to let people, users, sort of organically discover or create the language, the interaction, and the affordances that they want or that they expect, and then to sort of adjust the application based on their feedback or their input. Certainly, if we're doing, formalized tasks or very concrete, very known things, then you just follow the good UX rules. The big do this rule book for how you lay those affordances out, how you communicate those things. Some of the work that she's trying to do falls outside of that discipline, sort of the known what do's of that language, so to speak. So I think that's kind of what she's trying to get at, but correct me if I'm wrong. Over.
So Doris, I think you're so right in raising at this point the issue of, okay, let's be careful and not get carried away with these assumptions that we can easily just change expectations, and it's a tremendously risky thing, and we should only do it when necessary and with a very clear goal. I think what your comments bring up for me is the need to always bring in examples and context in here, because what I guess it's in my head, but I have not communicated it in this discussion, and I want to do it now, is that everything that I'm writing here and all these arrows and everything we're talking about, for me, it's happening in a spatial context. So in a way, for me, this is all architecture, quite literally sometimes. And that is something that I believe does not exist in gaming. I believe people who are game designers and come from that industry do not understand immersive space. They make all of those decisions with the tunnel and the blood and everything, I think, is narrative driven. And I think they draw on our reactions and the meaning that tunnels and light and darkness carry. But that's it. They do not go into the actual immersive qualities of that space. So what the work that I'm trying to do is to put all of this in the under the following headline or proposition, that there are affordances of immersive space that we can start to leverage in the context of giving users new workflows and new abilities that I'm not seeing done at all, and that is completely not even being touched upon in gaming. And I don't believe it's being touched upon in many VR applications, if at all, because I believe the people there come many times from a gaming background, and do not even see the potential of affordances in immersive space. And it's not just like it is not physical immersive space, is an immersive space where we can manipulate all these things, right? We have all of this control, and we actually can push in new behaviors, new workflows. So I that's why there's this big word here, architecture, that I put on the side. I'm lacking a better word for it, because I think what I'm talking about is not architecture. I wish I had a new word for it, but I do think it comes, the reason why for me this is so central is because I have an architecture background, and discussions like this and workshops like this are part of my attempt to even raise this issue to people, because it's not even easy to clarify it. So applications like the one we're working on for design with these two kind of perspectives are my attempt to kind of, discuss these things through actual implementations. The example that I gave with the hospital VR and how we try to address those issues, I think if they had gone to most other VR studios that do this kind of technical implementations of training, they would have had a completely different approach and a completely different initial understanding of what the problem was. Like we clearly told them in the first week after we wrapped our head through the material, the problem is spatial, and the problem has your problem is spatial, and it's a problem of abstraction and reversing that abstraction in a spatial context. So we gear the application towards using affordances in immersive space to try to address the problem. And if you look at all the example and all the work that we're doing, that's kind of the line of implementation that we're going after. So, but I realize now that might not be obvious to you, or as I'm drawing these arrows and making these schematics, you might not be contextualizing it with spatial affordances in the center, the way I am. And I also realized that a lot of this might still be kind of fuzzy and hard to understand. And I'm hoping I'm not completely failing in explaining myself. And hoping that the examples that I gave and the examples that we still have coming up out of the work that we do at Lumena, as they kind of accumulate, will start to clarify these points for more and more people.
No, just to say that what you're saying, it's I think, at least to me, it makes perfect sense, and this helped a lot. If you put the context, now that you mentioned the context, I think it's becoming even more clearer. What would help me and maybe some other people would be a few more examples, I guess, so we could actually see the actual implementation, not coming from architecture. You know, it's going to be probably helpful for us.
Yeah. So I had those examples. I can bring up maybe actually there's one that I really want to bring up, although I cannot release any images, but I will I'll tell you a little bit about what it is that's also gonna drive some of these points home. Yeah.
Would liminal spaces be a better term than architecture in the context you're trying to get at?
Yeah, maybe.
I know it kind of has its own definition in the gaming sphere, but it seems to fit when you look at the root definition, just outline.
Yeah, maybe. I'm collecting this terminology. I think liminal spaces is more potent in association and meaning. What architecture has and liminal spaces does not is more of at least for me, more a deeper understanding of action and behavior in space. Because as architects, at least like if you go through a proper education or practice, your focus at some point as you mature as an architect starts to depart from like what color is the wall or what materials on the roof, and go towards what kind of actions are your spaces encouraging, and trying to kind of think ahead of behavior through space. So you start to see space not just as a static thing, but as something that promotes and even gives birth to certain behavior, right? So it's kind of that line of thought in architecture, and that kind of thinking of space, not just as static and maybe storytelling, but as something that's driving action as behavior, that for me has given birth to this bigger interest in VR. So when we're talking about particularly like this thing here, so in my mind, when I'm working on this, I'm very much using things that I've learned and I have an intuition from designing architecture in thinking about these things. And of course, that I think opens up for me ideas that traditional UX designers might not, because this is in essence me doing UX with the mind of an architect. So for me, it's not just user and buttons. For me, is the entire space that's the playground that I'm designing.
I think what you're hinting at is space as an agent.
I love that. Yeah. All right. So I think this is I'm so happy with how productive this has been. So look, like we've just started, I had all of this collection of icons here, and we just pulled a hand and started this discussion with grabbing, and then someone said, okay, what kind of interactions are we doing? And we went so far in trying to instill logic and structure into into unclear, difficult questions just by questioning what is grabbing and what is interaction. And it took us here. So what I also want to say is that I'm really not proposing that these are, you know, these are, what do I want to say? These kind of structures are not real in an ontological sense. They're just a playground, right? So I'm not saying this is how it is. I just want you to take this as an example of methodology, of how we went from something undefined and difficult to wrap our hands around and difficult to build something on, with like some kind of degree of trust and excitement, and put some structure into it. But you should not take these structures and these arrows and these categories. You should take this, if anything, the methodology, and then build your own structures and your own arrows.
Yeah, like this is definitely the way, like, they try to teach you how to do science at university is you look at what's already been done in the space. You typically do a literature review first. You say, okay, what's already been done and what methods do they use? And then if you're trying to invent a new method or to look at that problem in a different light, usually your first step is to look at what are the existing solutions and why are they used? Because the why for those methods can help you derive a new method. So if the why of we're using a current method is it's cheap or it's inexpensive, then if something else comes out that's also inexpensive or you get a bigger budget, then that constraint no longer exists. And now you can look at different things.
Yep.
If that methodology was used because it is effective or it's easy to implement correctly, then as you look into other solutions that are more difficult, if you can optimize that workflow or simplify the process of getting that new solution stood up, then you remove that constraint from the established norm. And now you can look at introducing the new method into that space, which is sort of a lot of what VR has a problem with right now. And sort of what I tackled a little bit in my thesis was there was two sort of established ways to move people in VR when you have a larger virtual space than you do a physical space. And that is either you teleport them or you let them use a joystick or the touchpad and you push them, you slide them around. And both of those methods had their advantages and disadvantages. Point and click teleportation sort of established itself as the go-to movement method for VR because it was easy to code. It was easy to learn from a new user perspective, and it didn't make people throw up. So for those three things, it sort of cemented itself as this is just what everybody uses unless you have some very specific reason not to use this. And the sliding method was good because it lets you understand the space more. So the biggest drawback to using point and click teleportation is that as you move through a space, your mental map of that area gets fragmented. It's segmented because you're jumping from place to place. You're not walking, sliding. You don't have that constant visual stream to understand, relatively speaking, how far apart objects are or where they are in relation to each other. And so for certain spatial tasks like memory or navigating a space or puzzles, point and click teleportation is horrible because they can't build that mental map, or it gets built with holes, or it gets built inaccurately. Pieces get rotated, whatever it is. So for those kinds of applications, they tried to use the sliding methodology, but that makes a lot of people really sick. So they said, okay, well, we're like keeping a lot of our users out of being able to work with this. And it naturally doesn't look good for your stakeholders or your investors if half your user base is throwing up, and it's not good. So I ended up making a method that sort of sandwiched between those two and took the good parts of teleportation, the good parts of sliding, and sort of mashed them together. It turned out okay, but the main point was that it scored better on the first thing that I was trying to tackle, which is making people sick, because that is, as far as my opinion at the time, and probably still is, the biggest tackle to getting people in the headset is they're like, I don't want to get sick. So I wanted that to be my focus, and it turned out to work. So the fact that it was slightly better than point and click teleportation for mental mapping was good. It didn't quite make it up to where sliding was, but it was an improvement. So I think you take that methodology, and it looks like what we're getting at here is you look at what the established way to do things is, and then you look at why that became the established way, or why it's the established structure. And then you can pick out those constraints and see which one of them you still need to keep and which one of them you can throw away.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's also so many aspects where there is no good structure, where like, I think locomotion is a big topic. So that's the one that got a lot of attention and people really put thought and structure into it. But then there's a lot of stuff that is still like kind of up for grabs, like the stupid humanoid avatars and stuff. And the other thing I want to add to what Carl just said is, what we found is that if you do go through this process and try to based on work on something like this, it's every single time we found that the implementation of the structure has reaches far beyond what we initially were trying to solve, or what we initially thought the structure was about. And the most clear example that I have is what we discussed with the mini-me, right? So we have this duplication of the world that it's in miniature, and we just we duplicate the cameras, right? So we just have we basically have two cameras on the entire world. So we're filming the world at 1:1, and then we're filming the world again at this miniature scale, and you're in the view, right? Like the camera is filming the architecture that you're moving around, and also filming you. And then we just apply the same scripts that we did, the same components in Unity that allows you to move the stuff at either scale to all the objects in the scene. And we just, when we did that kind of blank application of the components to everything in all the game objects, we ended up dropping it on you as well. And then we ended up just like discovering that, oh, I guess I can move myself. So it was really kind of an unintended consequence of the setup, of the logical setup of the scene, and it became the main way of moving around, basically. So it just, the structure, the logic of the scene sprung out solutions for other problems that we were not directly triggering, that were congruent to the logic, right? So they were already operating within that logic. So we didn't have to sit down and come up with luckily come up with locomotion from scratch. So if your logical structure and assumption is strong, it will take you far. I guess that's my point. It will give you a space of possible solutions where everything is logically consistent with each other. That makes sense for the user. So once the user has understood that basic logic of the world, which is the logic of these initial assumptions and diagrams, then they can pick up a lot of other stuff, like this mini-me teleport function.
Yeah. So there's an actual like sort of sub-discipline for that. Specifically in gaming, it's looked at a lot. It's I don't remember what the formal name is, but it hints at systems designed for emergent behavior.
Yeah.
And that is basically exactly what you're talking about. It's how you mirror behavior or components across a wide variety of objects, structures, or places. And then the user learns what the limits are, what they can and can't do. And then they sort of put sequences of actions together to form a strategy for how they're going to move forward.
Yes. So this is, I think this is a major point to make, because it hints at the fact that these kind of logical structures are much more important than just satisfying some need to understand things, right? Like some intellectual urge to like, oh, I don't get that. Let me get it, or let me just do something that's cool and no one else is doing because I'm taking this further steps. Like it's something that's way bigger than that.